Hello, Bookstack. This is the recording of the meeting we had this past Saturday. It was a great conversation. We got into some really cool things. We had a lot of people come to this meeting, and so that made it a whole lot better. So hopefully you benefit from the different thoughts and opinions that are expressed and shared. We got into some really good thoughts, so I appreciate you watching through the whole video. Put your thoughts of the video in the comments below. I'd really like to hear what you guys think about it. So with no further ado, we're going to start the video.
So coming to terms with an author, this is another, I think. So I think the inspection reading part was one of my favorite parts of the book because I think it helped me grow a lot. This part of the book also, coming to terms with an author, and the next chapter, and really the one after that. So these next three kind of chapters, dealing with words and dealing with truth, were very impactful to me. Words versus terms. Again, a lot of this is stuff, and I was trying to tell them because people were kind of starting to get a little intimidated by the amount of information. And man, this seems really difficult and it seems really hard. And it's not really. I mean, you really understand. You may not have had the word for it to know that a word used over and over again in one way in a book was called a term, but you had that at least that idea. And I just feel like now what he's doing is just formalizes the idea that a term is a word or an idea used by an author over and over again, and then he packages that. So he packages terms, move into phrases and propositions and arguments. As you begin to understand, as a author begins to prove his point and begins to try to move information and knowledge from his mind to someone else's. But I don't know if any of you guys had any thoughts, anything that was impactful for you guys that you might want to share.
I mean, just in general, he's so thorough. I'm learning so much. It's something that I'm trying to get better at. And just listening, I'm like, man, this the things he's able to pull out of stuff, and I think that's a big thing of really getting understanding. Obviously, it's just it's kind of how much you dig into something, how thorough you are, and I mean, just in that aspect, I'm learning so much from him. Coming to terms of stuff, I didn't really. It's I guess it's not specifically simple, but it's I'm surprised that I never really came across that before. But yeah, I mean, how you come to terms with what they're trying to explain. You can't really relate with someone if you haven't come to terms with what they're putting across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I took a lot of notes at the beginning of the chapter myself because of that point. And I think we see just a lot of that today, especially the presidential debates, that have come up, and the news media, that they're not trying to come to terms with each other. I don't think they're really trying to understand what the other person is saying. And what he's saying, you can't have, the fact that language is so ambiguous, it can be a barrier to, rather than a means of communication, if the two parties aren't willing to go through the work to come to terms with each other. And so you can continue to misunderstand because I'm using this word to mean this thing, and you're understanding this word to mean this other thing. And so we're talking at the same time using the same word, meaning two different things. And if we're not willing to stop and pause and try to understand what the other person is saying and how they're using that other word, then you're just not going to have effective communication. And so I took a lot of notes at the beginning of the chapter when he was talking about the issues and the problems of the communication, because that's what I see a lot of today is that people aren't communicating. They're just talking to each other, and it's you're saying this, and I'm immediately jumping on it and saying, no, you're wrong, and I'm not in no way trying to figure out what it is you're actually saying. I'm not trying to come to terms with you. I'm just trying to overrun you with my words. Mm-hmm. But he is very thorough. Like I was saying at the beginning of the book, the guy's a philosopher. And so, philosophers are very thorough. They're basically, attorneys with thoughts and ideas. An attorney is not going to leave any stone unturned. They're going to be very thorough to make sure all the clauses and everything makes sense and feeds off each other and that there's no contradictions. Philosophers are going to do that same thing. And so that's why I didn't want people to be freaked out. I took an econometrics class in college, and the beginning of the class, the guy basically took 2 semesters of statistics and put it in 2 weeks of class. And so people were freaked out. They were dropping like flies, and I was telling everybody, I was like, just calm down. The whole course can't be like this. It can't be. So let's just get through this first part and then see how it is. And so that's what I was trying to, make sure everybody just kind of didn't freak out when he was so thorough and so wordy in explaining the ideas. It's just, he's a philosopher. It's not as difficult as you think it is just because of the amount of words there are. Like I said, coming to terms with an author, that's something that's pretty easy to understand. He just makes sure he explains it. Every little fine little detail turns over every rock. And so you can kind of really get the gist of it. But it is good to go through it all in detail. And I do like where he talks about if a book gives you problems, you're like, man, that word, I just don't understand it. Well, that's probably a good indication that that's an important word, most likely. If you find it being used over and over again, and if you find a difficult passage that's like, man, this is kind of hard to really work through. Well, again, that's probably a good indication. That's probably what the author is focusing on and trying to point to you. It's probably a level where it's probably an area where you have little understanding. And that's part of the reason that we're reading, is to move from an area of little understanding to, understanding what the author's saying. And so if you find a part that you don't understand, well, you found the part where the author has more knowledge than you do, and that's some knowledge that you need to acquire. So don't be intimidated by it. Don't quit on it. Don't just breeze past it. Those are everything else you can kind of just keep reading, keep pushing through. But those passages you find difficult, maybe where you need to put in a little bit of work. And he talks about in a later chapter, don't get bogged down continually and stop and stop and stop and stop and stop. And you just find out all these looking up every word and trying to work through every passage. It's not necessarily a good thing, because you'll lose the unity of the work. You'll kind of lose that overarching idea that the author's trying to get through. But if you continually see things come up over and over again, it might be if you're moving on to another area and you find that you don't understand enough to understand this new area, then it might be good to go back. Because again, my problem when I was in school with mathematics, part of my school with some of my science classes was I didn't learn that foundational part. I used to tell people in mathematics builds upon each other. It builds. So if you don't get algebra, you can forget geometry. If you don't know algebra, forget calculus, because you're not going to get it. You're not, because all of higher mathematics basically build off of algebra. And of course that's based off the basic arithmetic, but algebra is where people really start to struggle when you're introducing variables and all this other kind of stuff. So if you don't understand that, it's not worth it to move on to the next ones, because you're going to continue to fail and you're going to continue to be frustrated. So if you can get that understanding, the foundational understanding that the author's trying to give you, then you're not going to experience much frustration throughout the rest of the work or the rest of the book, because you're going to have that understanding. You're going to be able to continue to acquire. I think that's where people get frustrated and get, just quit on books, is because they don't take the time to come to terms and understand what the author's trying to say. Does anybody else have any thoughts or anything they want to share?
Yeah, I mean, that's for me, that's a common thing. I think when I was reading some speed reading books that it wasn't straight up how to read a book, but it was it's trying to assist you in getting information out. Yeah, like they always, a common thing throughout is get the overarching ideas. Because I mean, you'll just frustrate yourself trying to go in too deep on every little point, when really, I mean, the author's not really trying to trick you per se. I think like most authors aren't really trying to confuse you. You just can't you can't confuse yourself. Just look at the overarching idea and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point to say that, the author's not trying to confuse you or trying to trip you up. He wants you to read it, and he wants you to a good author wants you to read it, wants you to understand it. And, he actually wrote this book. I don't know if you read the preface, but he wrote this book in response to speed reading courses. And so that was kind of a popular thing back in the day. And so he wrote it in response to that. He was just saying, everything shouldn't be read at the same speed. Can you speed through a very difficult philosophical work? Probably not. And should you? No, you shouldn't. But he said, but there are different things that you can just blow through and read and just grab that overarching idea. And he said the real skill is knowing the difference, knowing what can be read very quickly and what needs to be read a little bit more slowly, a little bit more thoroughly. And so when he gets to the third part of the book, he starts talking about what should be read at what speed. And I like his idea that you should read as fast as you can, as is comfortable for you, or as slow as is comfortable for you, but fast enough that you're not getting bogged down, you're not getting frustrated, but you're also continuing to gain understanding. But you don't want to read so slow that it's uncomfortable, but so fast that you're not gaining the understanding point. Because again, like we've been talking about, the point of reading is growing and understanding. Could I sit down and flip through the pages and read 100 books a year? Sure I could, but am I gaining as much as I can out of each one? But I know some people who will take 2 years to read one book. And I'm like, it's impossible for you to have any sort of understanding of the thread of the book. I mean, you're going to remember that book so segmentedly. You might understand one part, but how all of this fits together. And that's the thing, especially with history. History, he talks about as a narrative. It's primarily in the narrative style. There's a reason they choose the facts that they do. So if you're reading the 5th chapter of a history book, you think it can just stand alone on its own. And most of the time, that's really not that true, because a historian has a story they're trying to tell. And, they have a place they're trying to get to. And so if you only understand it segmentally, you're going to get to the end of the book and be like, wow, that was, 7 interesting facts from history. That's great. It's like, well, no, all of these things fit together. And unless you read them all at the same time, you're not really going to get it. Like, I've been reading Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which is, it should be on every single person in the United States' reading list. It's a history written from the perspective of the people. So he talks about government decisions, and you read a history book, and this is why they did it, and this is why that decision was so great, and this was fantastic. Well, he writes it from the perspective of the people and with the effect that it had on them. And so as you're reading through the history, it's a rather difficult history book to read, I'm learning, because it's not as linear as most history books are. Because you'll get into the next chapter and he'll go back in time. And then he'll come trace another story arc up to where you kind of were in history to tell you why this particular point is significant and how it fits in with all these other points and other things that were going on at the time. So it's a little hard, because sometimes it's like he's in the 1800s and it's great and you're fine, and then it's like, oh, but then 1720, and you're like, all right, what was happening in 1720? So that could be kind of tough. But if I would have read it chapter by chapter, it would not have been nearly as beneficial as had I read it as in one unifying story. So I hope that makes sense. So unless somebody has any final thoughts on chapter 8.
Well, I kind of laughed a little bit when Paul said that the author's not trying to trick you, because one of the things about this chapter, and one of the things about this chapter is that it's like, but I never put it into words, is how much language is like an obstacle when you're communicating. Because in my mind, I think, especially when I'm like trying to write things, I feel like if I say it perfectly, it should be received, well, in my mind, perfectly, it'll be received completely by the person who's reading it. They'll receive it in the way that I intended it. And I guess he did say, as a writer, you do aim to kind of meet them as close as you can to communicating well, but that there's also a part of the reader that has to dig to meet. I think he used the phrase, meeting on a mountain, two climbers coming from different ends meeting on a mountain. To try to get them to meet together, they had to have some form of terms defined before them, or a way to understand to get them at the same point at the top of the mountain. But I had never really thought about how, language is a barrier, or could be a barrier to getting your thought across, that there's a step between thinking it and writing it or saying it. and then somebody receiving on that. It seems it's like, oh, this should make perfect sense, but I would have never openly just said, oh yeah, using words might get in the way of getting your thought across. So I found that interesting, especially because when you think about it, just in speech and just talking to people, of course it is. Of course, sometimes you can't because your words are insufficient or they're inadequate, or just on the receiver's end, it's hard for them to understand. But getting to see just the part of the writer and the reader in that, that catcher and pitcher role again was interesting.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to go back to, was that analogy he used of the pitcher and the catcher, that the ball, being the words or the information, is the only thing that is not active. A catcher is just as active as the pitcher is in receiving the communication. So yeah, I mean, there's work to be done on the part of the reader as well as the writer. And I write from time to time. I know some of you write. Sometimes you know how difficult it can be to accurately convey a thought you have on paper. Sometimes it can be very difficult to find the wording right, and then you have to understand that when the person reads it, they may take a part of it or understand a piece of it, or they may have spaced or blanked out on a particular passage that was pivotal to, you getting your thought across. And that's why I think reading groups are important. I never really got the idea of a book club, until maybe the past couple of years. But it really helps you to gain perspective and see how, I think it can really help you come as close as you possibly can by having a group discussion about a book to really understand what an author's trying to say. Because again, you may catch something that I miss, and I may catch something that you miss, or we may both catch it. We think we got it, but as we talk about it, we realize, oh no, that's actually a third thing. And I think just discussing it and coming together with many different people's ideas and perspectives, it can really help you, find what is the author saying, what are they communicating. And I've just found it helpful because I've never been part of a formal book club that actually met. I mean, I've been part of one that met for a little bit and they didn't quite go through the whole process. But I've had discussions with people on a one-on-one basis and realized just how helpful it was to me to hear from another person's perspective. And it's like, man, I didn't even think about that. Like we read The Yellow Wallpaper one time. I may have been in school, and it's about a lady who goes crazy and her husband is trying to help her. But she's the narrator of the whole story. And so we were going through the whole thing and, why do you think she did this? And why do you think her husband's doing that? And then someone was like, well, the lady's narrator is admittedly crazy. She's admittedly having a psychotic episode. Can you trust anything that she says? She's your source of all the information in the story, and she's admitted that she's psychotic. And you're like, huh, now that's interesting. And it's like, man, that was a really good thought. And so it colored the whole story. Just that one perspective put the whole story in a different frame. So it can be helpful to get together and discuss it. We only have a few minutes left, about 8.5 minutes. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about chapter 9, determining an author's message. So obviously the words he uses and the terms he used, communicate knowledge to you, but why is he trying to communicate that specific knowledge to you? What is he trying to say? So, his words and his terms are basically his tools to communicate a message. So not only do we need to understand those terms, I guess the reason we have to understand those terms is so that we can understand his message and receive his message. And this is when he starts getting into something that few people actually do, few people actually understand how to do. So this chapter and the next chapter get really important because he starts talking about arguments and propositions. And so I think you'll find I might get a little bit more animated in the next video because he starts talking about arguments and logic and how you cannot argue facts. You can feel a certain way about facts, but dealing with truth is not something that emotions are involved in. Emotions are not involved in determining what is and isn't true. unfortunately. I mean, there are certain things, that emotions can be involved in or whatever, but when it comes to a hardcore fact or we're dealing with numbers or something like that, it doesn't matter how you feel about 2 + 2 equaling 4. Some of us feel certain ways at the end of the month when we look at our bank account, and, that's the numbers, but it doesn't matter how you feel about it. It doesn't change that number that's in that, on the paper. So I don't know if anyone had read about doing, finding the arguments, finding the propositions, seeing how the propositions build up to arguments. If anybody had any thoughts on that, this would be in the chapter 9 area.
I didn't have any particular thoughts on that, but I did enjoy rule number 9, which I think applies to not just reading books, but politics. You must be able to say with reasonable certainty, I understand, before you can say any one of the following things. I agree, I disagree, or I suspend judgment. And I think a lot of us, it sounds good, so I agree with it, rather than understanding the person's position first. I just thought that was a really good rule.
Yeah, and I think that's really what he says in rule 9. Actually, is chapter 10.
Oops.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But because it really gives everybody an idea of where the author is going. Because that is the point, is to understand what the author's saying. That's why you're reading a book, and that's why he said it's good to do an inspectional reading of a book, because you're determining whether or not what the author's trying to say is even worthy of reading. You may look through a book, and I read a book one time. The whole book, 200 something pages, was on one experiment done at a university. And it's like, I literally could have read the back of the book, the table of contents, the preface, and the first chapter, and learned every single thing I possibly needed to know about this whole thing. But I was 100 pages in and realizing, this guy's just going to say the same thing over and over again. I'm done with the book. I received all the understanding I needed to receive out of the book. So had I done a thorough inspection or reading, I would have realized, it's not worth reading this whole thing. It's not worth reading the whole book. So under determining an author's message, coming to terms, understanding what this other person is, then you go through the process of, do I agree or disagree? He says in the book, again, it's coming up, that you're obligated to think on these terms, and you're obligated to come to your own conclusion. But I do like going back to what Christian said in rule number 9, was you being able to state what the author's saying in your own words as a test for understanding. Because you said if you can only parrot back the words that the author said, then it is, you all have only received words from the author and not knowledge. And the other thing is giving a relevant life experience that you've had. Because he says sometimes that's just as powerful as stating it in your own words, because you're now being able to apply it to your real life. And obviously knowledge and anything that's really relevant to you should apply to your real life. You should be able to think of an example or an experience that relates to what the author is saying.
Like I said, we had a great time. I hope that you liked that. Don't forget to try to come to the next one. So we're gonna try to have these every Saturday. We're gonna maybe try to find a better time if it works better for people, or as more people begin to join, to see what works for everyone. Maybe even change the day if it works better. So if you have any thoughts or opinions on that, again, hit us down in the comments. You can hit us on Twitter, and we have an email address as well, ourbookstack@gmail.com. And the Twitter is @mybookstack. You can get that all in the links in the description and all the details. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on these videos. It really helps. I really appreciate all the support that everyone's been sharing and helping the show along. It's really been it's just great to have people kind of come alongside of you and help you and make this thing great. So by sharing and liking and commenting, every little bit helps. So don't forget to do that, and I'll catch you in the next video.